A vessel was approaching the enforcement line. No warning, no communication, no permission requested. The ship named Rich Starry simply changed course, increased speed, and headed straight for the U.S. Navy's corridor in the Strait of Hormuz, as if nothing stood in its way. On the deck of an American warship, every system activated at once. What unfolded over the next several minutes sent a signal that reverberated across three capitals. Not because of the cargo aboard, not because of its destination, but because of who dispatched it, and because of what happened when the most powerful naval concentration ever assembled in that waterway responded without delay, without negotiation, and without compromise. China had just tested the blockade. The United States had just delivered its answer. But here is what almost no one is saying about that moment.
The ship turning around was not the critical event. The critical event was what it exposed about a rivalry that has been intensifying for years, buried beneath trade deals, diplomatic exchanges, and carefully calibrated statements from Beijing. For the first time in modern memory, the distance between what China claims it can accomplish and what it can actually enforce was laid bare in public in real time on the world's most scrutinized passage. And the consequences of that revelation extend far beyond one tanker reversing course. Stay with me because what is happening in the Strait right now is not just about Iran. It is about the actual boundaries of Chinese power, and the world is about to discover exactly where those boundaries lie. If you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of clarity anywhere else, hit that subscribe button right now. This is the kind of analysis that matters when the global order shifts under our feet. Stay with me. To grasp why one ship turning back carries the weight, it does you need to understand what Beijing and Tehran built together over 15 years, because the blockade did not merely halt Iranian oil exports, it severed a strategic partnership both nations had invested years constructing and that China had grown dependent on in ways that went well beyond market pricing. China is Iran's primary trading partner and overwhelmingly its largest oil buyer. But the relationship runs deeper than transactions. Iran provided China with access to Middle Eastern infrastructure through corridor projects, most notably ports that gave Beijing routes bypassing traditional American-controlled networks. In return, China offered Iran technology infrastructure, diplomatic protection in multilateral bodies, and critically a shadow fleet of vessels moving Iranian crude to Chinese facilities, despite Western sanctions keeping the Islamic Republic economically viable through years of pressure that would otherwise have crippled it. Together, they had constructed a system, a conduit of energy, capital, and strategic cover flowing between them, operating largely outside mechanisms Washington governed. Iran required Chinese demand for economic survival. China required Iranian oil to remain affordable and its Middle Eastern presence to stay strategically relevant. Then the United States Navy dismantled the entire apparatus in a single operation, the core of Iran's export infrastructure through which 90% of Iranian crude moves sealed. China's alternative access point that avoided Hormuz locked. The primary maritime gateway for everything entering or leaving Iran by sea closed. Every channel through which Beijing had been acquiring sanctioned Iranian oil was shut simultaneously. The Belt and Roads Iranian component became operationally worthless overnight. Billions in Chinese infrastructure investment stranded. The diplomatic shield Beijing had extended Tehran through international organizations rendered meaningless because the challenge was no longer being addressed through diplomacy. It was being addressed through carrier strike groups and surface combatants backed by continuous aerial coverage and subsurface operations that China had no capacity to challenge in that theater. Hundreds of millions of barrels of Iranian oil loaded and waiting, stranded with no viable destination. The strategic connection built over years severed in hours. But even that was not the moment that fully revealed the depth of China's predicament. That moment arrived when Beijing decided to determine whether the blockade held. The tanker-rich Starry moved toward the enforcement zone and committed. Within minutes, it reversed. Additional tankers duplicated the maneuver in quick succession. Chinese associated vessels turned back before arrival. No shots exchanged, no standoff, no confrontation, just course reversal and signal received. China's defense minister stood before cameras and delivered words calculated to project authority. He stated Chinese vessels had passed Hormuz. He stated China maintained agreements with Iran. He stated the United States should refrain from interfering in Chinese matters. Forceful language, commanding language distributed across every official outlet in China and transmitted through diplomatic networks worldwide. And yet not one ship benefited from those words. Not one vessel crossed the corridor Beijing implied it possessed the capability and determination to protect. The gap between declaration and outcome was visible to every naval command, every intelligence apparatus, and every government monitoring this crisis. And that gap is where the most hazardous calculation of this entire standoff now resides. China's challenge is not solely the interruption of Iranian oil. That disruption alone is absorbable, at least short term. China maintains roughly 130 days of strategic reserves. It can source alternatives at elevated cost. It can manage the immediate shock painfully but functionally. The genuine problem is Hormuz itself, and the mathematics clarify precisely why. China imports over 10 million barrels daily almost entirely by maritime routes. Roughly 40% of that volume transits the strait not only from Iran but from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar. Aggregate the flows, and approximately half of China's total seaborne supply depends on that single choke point remaining open. As long as American naval forces control the passage, China's energy stability is in immediate tangible terms subject to American discretion. That is not a tolerable strategic condition for a nation that has devoted 2 decades positioning itself as an ascending power capable of functioning independently of American frameworks. It is not tolerable for an economy whose industrial foundation, manufacturing output, and political cohesion all hinge on dependable, affordable energy. And it is not tolerable for a ruling party whose internal legitimacy depends on sustained growth delivered to 1.4 billion citizens told their nation is achieving superpower standing. This is why Rich Starry's reversal carries significance beyond its cargo. It was the instant China's assertion of peer status with the United States faced testing in the actual world on actual waters and fell measurably short. So what are Beijing's options now? This is where the confrontation enters its most precarious phase because China has choices and none of them favorable. Option 1, direct military engagement. Can China deploy warships to Hormuz to break the enforcement by force? Theoretically, yes. China maintains an overseas facility in Djibouti. The People's Liberation Army Navy has expanded substantially. Its port infrastructure spanning the Horn of Africa through the Indian Ocean to the Gulf provides logistical support for operations. But Hormuz represents an entirely different strategic environment from anything China has operationally tested. Against the forces currently assembled carrier strike groups accompanied by over 15 surface combatants, fighters maintaining continuous air patrol, maritime surveillance aircraft covering every sector, submarines operating below, and tens of thousands of personnel in theater, the Chinese Navy confronts serious disadvantage. A Chinese warship forcing the line means direct military collision between nuclear powers at sea. The last comparable dynamic occurred during the Cuban crisis when Soviet freighters approached American blockade lines. That crisis remains the closest recorded approach to nuclear exchange. Analysts observing this confrontation invoke that parallel deliberately. China is not positioned to accept that gamble, not with Taiwan tensions elevated, not with its economy already absorbing trade war impacts. Not in a theater where American military dominance is unambiguous and overwhelming. Option 2, what China perfected in the South China Sea. Gray zone operations. Coast Guard vessels instead of military ships. Civilian militia craft instead of combat assets. Establishing presence without crossing the threshold, triggering open conflict. Beijing could attempt commercial convoys with Coast Guard escort, creating non-military but deterrent formations through the strait. But this approach succeeds against regional coast guards or patrol craft. It fails against carrier strike groups. If China deploys a gray zone convoy and America intercepts it, Beijing's positioning collapses before global observation. The entire narrative of multipolar order China has constructed over a decade dissolves in one incident. Option 3, the domain China navigates best. Diplomatic and economic leverage. Beijing holds permanent Security Council veto authority. It can obstruct resolutions legitimizing the blockade. It can mobilize international resistance supporting Iran's conditional passage claims. It can intensify trade confrontation, liquidate treasury holdings, weaponize supply dependencies in sectors where Chinese market control grants genuine influence. But none of these instruments open the strait. Diplomatic processes operate on monthly and yearly timelines. Chinese refineries operate on daily and weekly requirements. The veto does not deliver oil to terminals. China's economic retaliation capacity, while substantial cuts reciprocally, escalating trade conflict injures the Chinese economy precisely when it absorbs energy disruption. Option 4. What Beijing actually executes currently: waiting, calculating, absorbing damage while ensuring competitors absorb more. China has suspended fuel exports, pressuring Japan and South Korea, weakening regional competitors dependent on Chinese re-exports. It has resumed American long purchases, reopening flows suspended during trade disputes, attempting diplomatic leverage through economic engagement while military confrontation intensifies. It positions itself as essential fuel supplier to Southeast Asian nations seeking alternatives, expanding regional influence even as its own energy circumstances deteriorate. China endures pain but ensures rivals endure worse. It is determined presently that patience outweighs escalation. Option 5, requiring maximum time but potentially maximum consequence. Constructing alternatives, bypassing Hormuz entirely. China has invested years in infrastructure circumventing the strait, notably corridors through Pakistan's port facilities, theoretically enabling Gulf oil into China overland without Hormuz transit. The crisis validates those investments strategically, but capacity cannot yet match Hormuz throughput. Long-term solution to immediate emergency. Does not address refinery requirements now. Every option carries massive cost. Beijing calculates but refrains from hazard. That gap between rhetoric and action constitutes the crisis's paramount strategic disclosure. American side forces assembled at Hormuz represent among the most substantial naval concentrations in contemporary history and expanding. Carrier strike groups already operate full readiness regionally. When complete deployment arrives, the United States will maintain multiple full carrier groups simultaneously committed to single operational theater, over 50,000 personnel, dozens of the most sophisticated surface vessels constructed, continuous air dominance sustained perpetually, submarine coverage beneath. No comparable force exists near the strait. No force China could deploy matches it. No combination of Iranian coastal systems creates credible conventional threat against this power concentration. But American presence carries limits, and understanding those limits clarifies resolution pathways. Sustaining multiple carrier groups indefinitely single theater proves logistically exhausting. Carriers demand constant maintenance. Personnel rotations constrain sustained deployment. Munitions resupply and fuel operations for forces this scale constitute substantial continuous undertakings. Crucially, every asset concentrated Hormuz cannot simultaneously position Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, or other theaters where flashpoints observe this crisis intensely. Allied participation has proven far more constrained than Washington anticipated. Some states announced support, others explicitly declined blockade participation, focusing mine clearance, humanitarian navigation instead. Some refused involvement. America operates the century's most consequential naval mission substantially unilaterally. The blockade, while operationally effective, remains imperfect. Tracking confirms Iran-associated vessels transited since enforcement began. Some carried active sanctions. America apparently selects which vessels intercept, which permit, revealing both practical enforcement limits across the world's busiest corridors and political calculations beneath each decision. One vessel reversed initially but transited second approach. Blockade real. Blockade functioning. Blockade not absolute. That gap between policy and reality where China probes tests pushes daily. Iran's position underwent transformation unimaginable months prior. Decades Iranian doctrine rested single strategic foundation. Capacity closing Hormuz rendered Iran untouchable. Closure threat deterred action. Actual closure granted leverage globally. Hormuz constituted Iran's weapon deterrent insurance against overwhelming conventional power arrayed against it. Since operations began, leverage stripped systematically. Air defense collapsed initial weeks. Coalition aircraft penetrated airspace, struck central Tehran, returned intact. Underground facilities described impenetrable, breached by bombers carrying penetrating munitions. Naval installations leveled. Command structures fractured. Intelligence leadership eliminated. Logistics centers struck. Proxy supply lines disrupted. Iran closed Hormuz, drove oil past $150, triggered European fuel crises, generated Asian economic pain, paralyzed global shipping, proved ultimate deterrent functional. Then America responded, not reopening, restoring previous arrangement, but seizing the strait entirely. Systematically clearing mines, establishing secure corridor, opening world commerce, simultaneously locking every Iranian port behind blockade, halting oil departure while permitting other flows. Strait open, everyone except Iran. Iran sought punishing the world, closing Hormuz. America's response, elegant, devastating, opening it but locking you inside. Iran's weapon reversed. Iran's logic inverted, deployed superior force against originating nation. What options remain, Tehran? Theoretically multiple, practically none. Laying additional mines requires craft operating waters under constant surveillance, aerial coverage. Attempting conventional naval exit, impossible, facilities destroyed, fleets degraded. Striking Gulf infrastructure permanently alienates Saudi Arabia. UAE deepens isolation, economically unsustainable. Activating proxy networks, Lebanon, Yemen simultaneously expands conflict, justifying responses exceeding prior operations. Every choice worsens Iran's standing. Daily blockade continuation compounds economic pressure irreversibly. Storage timeline running. Revenue hemorrhage accumulating. Well closure approaching. Domestic crisis already mobilizing, streets numbers nearly collapsing, regime intensifying catastrophically. So arrives the question every government, military, trading floor, energy market simultaneously asks. How concludes? Three futures active. Materialization determined by decisions Beijing, Tehran, Washington currently executing. Future 1 negotiation. Iran returns proposing framework addressing nuclear language permitting regime claim while conceding core demand. China's unacknowledged intensifying pressure as energy security erodes, tips calculation toward agreement. Blockade lifts. Framework signs. Strait normalizes international oversight. Washington architects this future. Entire maximum pressure structure blockade, financial squeeze, storage countdown, engineered rendering this Tehran's sole rational selection. Future 2 expansion. Iran activates proxies. Second critical waterway disrupted simultaneously. Chinese convoy tests blockade, quasi-military escort generating confrontation. Neither Beijing-Washington fully governs. Ceasefire collapses. Operations resume, tighter enforcement. Oil breaches, recession triggering levels. Conflict exceeds intended boundaries. Nobody desires this future, but probability increases. Daily diplomatic aperture contracts. Future 3 extended impasse. Blockade sustains insufficient, forcing Iran rapidly. American sustainability questioned. Allied participation fails, materializing. China continues probing sanctioned vessels, some penetrating, maintaining Iranian trickle, marginally extending runway. Crisis persists unresolved, inflicting escalating pain all involved. Restructuring energy markets around alternatives requiring years construction, leaving region permanently scarred by confrontation, lacking resolution. Cuban crisis lasted 13 days, concluded because one side blinked. Someone Moscow observed blockade line, observed military reality, calculated cost pushing through, exceeded possible gain. Same fundamental equation unfolds, different strait, different participants, different armaments, but identical core logic. Military power establishes line. Diplomatic channels sole pathway avoiding catastrophe. China's vessels reversed. Defense minister issued declarations protecting nothing. Beijing calculates, refrains risk. That calculation, that deliberate restraint, potentially singular critical variable determining crisis resolution or uncontainable escalation. Distance between words, actions defines actual power balance, contemporary era. Strait of Hormuz, that distance measured real time, vessel by vessel, decision by decision, day by day. Storage clock counting toward transformative moment. Hormuz no longer Iran's weapon. Hormuz now Iran's confinement. World suspended observing who blinks. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts below. Subscribe to stay current. Tap the video appearing now.